Thank you very much for joining us today. Our guest today is Professor Jane Adolphe. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for asking me.
Professor Adolphe is a Catholic international human rights lawyer and a professor of law at Ave Maria School of Law in Naples, in Florida, as well as visiting professor in Collegium Intermarium,
Yes.
now in Warsaw at our Collegium Intermarium University. Professor Adolphe is a civil lawyer called to practice law in the state of New York, USA, and province of Alberta, Canada, a canon lawyer and an international human rights lawyer who from 2003 to 2020 worked for the Holy See. After working as an outside consultant to the Holy See's Secretariat of State, section for relations with states, she entered the same section as an expert to collaborate on work related to human rights treaties, most notably Convention on the Rights of the Child, Optional Protocol on the Sale of Children, Child Prostitution and Child Pornography. And just 2 years ago, you co-authored and published a volume under the title Clerical Sexual Misconduct and Interdisciplinary Analysis. Mm-hmm. And it was also a topic of your open lecture given here at Collegium Intermarium.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Concerning the sexual misconduct in the Catholic Church. What was the hardest part of this analysis, and what was the hardest part of preparation of the book you published?
I think because I'd been working on the child protection issues for so many years, and there had been so many positive developments that when a series of events occurred in 2018, so it was in Chile, Honduras, and the McCarrick scandal in the United States that involved bishops and clerics actually abusing seminarians was largely the story, and homosexual culture in seminary in Honduras. I think at that point it brought to mind that all of the church what it had been doing doesn't mean much if the majority of the children or child victims are adolescent boys, and some seminarians, if at the same time we have people promoting homosexual acts as a good, and this is what's happening in the church. And so that was, number one, shocking to me to see these events all coming together in 2018. It was shocking to me to see that a cardinal had been tagged as a predator for years, absolutely years, make it all the way up through the hierarchy to become a cardinal. That was something that was shocking to me, as well as the idea that somehow we can be promoting homosexual acts as a good under the cover of accompaniment or some sort of broad-based pastoral care.
I remember when the reports were published, ordered by the American Council of Bishops of the United States, John Jay College report. And then after a few years, we had a very similar report published in Germany, prepared by the universities and ordered by the German Council of Bishops, both showing that 2/3 of the victims were adolescent boys. But the final recommendations of both of the reports did not tackle this issue as homosexuality.
Right. And so that's the same thing with the John Jay study. So you have, and the other commissions that have been done, like in Australia and in other countries, the majority of victims are usually outside the church, just in general population, because this is not only a church issue with respect to sexual abuse of children, it's usually girls and women. But in the church, the majority of them are boys. And now what we know, it's adolescent boys. It is not pre-adolescent boys. So it's adolescent boys, and it's young adults, and it's these seminarians. And the seminarians, of course, alongside children, are a type of vulnerable group as well, because they're in these total institutions that control where they stay, what they eat, what they study, and it's their vocation.
But the argument is often raised that in fact it is celibacy to be blamed for the sexual misconduct
Okay, so in the book we tackled, the book that we did, it was a conference about sexual abuse of boys and sexual abuse of adult men. And we focused on seminarians against. So we tackled the issue directly when people were ignoring it, and as you just highlighted through these commissions. And we found in the United States the statistics of a higher rate of people self-identifying as homosexual in the church than in regular society in terms of the numbers. And these were in certain years from the 1970s, and I think they peaked in the 1980s, and then maybe even into the 1990s. And then they decreased. And what we saw was a correlation between the peak of the largest amount of men self-identifying as homosexuals and also a peak in the number of attacks against adolescent boys. And that was based on statistics of the John Jay studies, together with a Los Angeles Times survey that questioned 5,000 priests who self-identified as homosexuals. So we put that evidence together and discussed it in detail, not only in that study, but I think we had 3 or 4 chapters devoted to the homosexuality issue and the problems in the church.
And has anything changed after the decision of the Holy See in the beginning of the 21st century to stop accepting active homosexuals to the seminaries across the world?
Well, I think what our study showed, because his name is Reverend Paul Sullins, and he's also a professor at Catholic University of America, and he also did a second chapter on the amount of abuses post-2000, and he saw that there was a decline during the pontificate of John Paul II, and then he saw a slight rising since 2002, despite the United States Conference of Bishops bringing in new rules and regulations. And so he's concerned that perhaps there's some sort of lack of attention because now there's a new fervor to deal with this from a regulation point of view in terms of protection systems. And he's concerned that perhaps there's been a lapse in our attention to the issue. He also saw a pretty consistent level of abuse against young girls and women, and that's always been. But what we can surely see from his statistics is that there is a tie between a higher, greater situation of priests self-identifying as homosexual in the years where there was so many, and rising cases of abuse of adolescent boys.
I asked for this decision from the beginning of the 21st century because the issue of the proper reactions of the Holy See and personally John Paul II is now very important in the Polish public debate. Last Sunday in many churches in Poland, the letter of the president of the Conference of Bishops was presented on the John Paul II reaction and the proper reactions of John Paul II to the sexual misconduct cases. What is your opinion on that? What was the reaction of John Paul II? Was he aware of the situation, and did he react to the situation with the proper tools, legal and proper tools of personal authority?
Right. Well, one thing we have to say is the sexual abuse as being a crime in the church or a delict in the church has been there for centuries, okay? So Brother Damien, I believe in the 12th century, came out forcefully with this issue, and there's been others like him. And so this isn't a new issue, and there has been developments in the area. I think you have to take into consideration that what we have with technology and the therapeutic society in which we live, we have a greater attention to the suffering of victims. And that's over centuries, and that's over in our history. And so the tools in the church have always been there. They're canon law. And who uses canon law? It's your local diocese. And if they are advising the bishop not to use penal processes or not to use administrative processes, which there's both. There's administrative penal, I believe. And so if they're advising the bishop not to use these processes, then you're not using the tools that are there. And that doesn't go that's not under the authority of John Paul II, because in the church, the church is not run like a CEO that controls everyone at the local level. And so what you have to do is you have to look at the authority of the bishops and whether they were using the tools that we had. Now, there are canonists that are saying we had plenty of tools, but canon law in and of itself leaves enormous discretion to bishops, local bishops. And that's the way our system is set up. Now, if you want to change the system, that's another discourse, but you have to look at the cultural, systemic, and legal system that we've had and work within that system. Bishops have discretion. They have the tools, they didn't use them. We also know that with the McCarrick case, the Holy See did issue a report, for example, of everything it knew about the McCarrick case. And what struck me was that there were two bishops, and I don't know about the timing of this report. The report came out on November 10th, and it was after the passing away of one of these bishops, so maybe it was delayed for that, I don't know. But there was two bishops in one incident that were there present when McCarrick was sexually molesting the priest, a young priest, at the dinner table. They never reported it. And they never indicated that it was a problem in any of the correspondence. Again, those are bishops, and they hid that information. Now, if McCarrick himself then went to the Pope and says, I didn't do any of this, I mean, we do have this understanding in the church of good faith. You take people of good faith, give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't know whether any of us would have acted any differently, but believe a cardinal that's come to us pleading that there's someone against him and that he's presenting himself as not touching any children. That's called a lie.
And in fact, the silence of the bishops in executing their responsibility, their legal responsibility to prosecute sexual misconduct, led in the last years to centralization of power. And in fact, it was a challenge to the Pope, a challenge to the Holy See to take those issues to the highest level and to escalate them up to the Holy See and to provide documents and procedures and decisions on this level of the papal authority. Right. And what is your opinion on the decisions and on the procedures that were enacted in the previous years?
Well, I mean, you had the canon law that has an administrative process to deal with these penal cases, and also, you know, you can set up a penal tribunal. So I was at meetings in the United States. I was at a canon law meeting where the practicing canonists got up and said, we did not know how to set up a tribunal, a penal tribunal, but you don't really have to. You've got penal administrative processes. But in any event, they said, we didn't advise the bishop to do that. So in the years of early 2000, what happened was the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, actually through Archbishop Scicluna, prepared all of these materials, and then he actually went to the United States and started to teach these canonists how to set up penal tribunals. And so there was this then teaching right from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And of course, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, you know, there's an aspect of what they do that's a court. And so it was this helping the local level do what they need to do. Now, what's happened since is that there have been developments in what we need for children, and they're called child protection systems. And now they're in place, for example, in the United States. We didn't have those 50 years ago. We certainly didn't have them centuries ago. And so you have to take into consider again that these things develop over time, as well as our knowledge about the suffering with respect to victims. One of the things we also have to acknowledge is that the therapeutic culture that was in the church too, with psychologists saying that taking in a priest after he's abused kids and then sending him back out and saying to the bishop he'll be fine. There was also that going on. Now you cannot detach either some of what the psychologists were saying from the Alfred Kinsey sexologist, this idea of Alfred Kinsey, I believe in the 50s, maybe even 40s. he was promoting this understanding of sexuality, that it's always fluid, that children are sexual beings. And he did these tests that on children and even babies that you could argue, and people have, that it was actually criminal acts to get his evidence. This became the voice of the sexual revolution. So all of this is happening within a certain era and historical developments. We deal with this in our book, and Monsignor Mezerkiewicz from the university here in Warsaw, he did a wonderful chapter going through actually the ideology of Marxism, the sexual revolution, the therapeutic culture in the church, the improper Eucharistic culture in the church, and he also dealt with other issues. We had a canonist too that dealt with all the canon law issues.
And this is very much in line with the letter of Benedict XVI on the roots of the sexual misconduct.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what you have is you have this deep in the church, where we've always had the problem over centuries and trying to deal with it with canon law. You then have this sexual revolution in the 60s that actually provoked this increase of men in the seminaries that came into the church self-identifying as homosexuals and acting out. And that you have a rise in these cases, and then during the pontificate of John Paul II, there's a sharp decline. And that sharp decline goes against the argument of opportunity. It's just an opportunity of these sexual priests. These priests that use the altar boys because they're there. And I think you have to, from a common sense, understand that a normal man in the presence of a adolescent boy doesn't have these urges. So even the opportunity kind of argument that was made in the John Jay study is just not persuasive.
And those men going into the seminaries with their homosexual urges, with their readiness to commit criminal acts against adolescent boys, they were described by Father Professor Okno in his book on Lavender Mafia as criminal camarilla inside of the church, covering up sexual misconduct of different members of the clergy. Did you read the book of Father Okno? Well, what's your opinion on this perspective?
Okay, so in 2018, the one case that came out from Honduras was a situation in the seminary, the major seminary there, that collects most of the priests from around the whole country, and what had happened there is a seminarian had attempted to commit suicide because he had broken off his lustful relationship with another seminarian. Now, a letter was written by 80, I believe 80 of, maybe 40 of the 180 seminarians, and it was sent to the Honduran Conference of Bishops saying, you have to do something here about this culture, you've got to clean it up. Now, the National Catholic Register had reported that story, Edward Penton, and a spokesperson for the Honduran Conference of Bishops then came back against National Catholic Register and the EWTN, and basically it's a major broad-based network in the United States, and blamed them in the sense of creating these stories. Now, Edward Penton stuck to his story, and they published the letter, the suicide note. They published other information they had, and they had videotapes that were exchanged and texts that were between seminarians that were lustful. So that was a situation. One of the things that Edward Penton underlined in his article is the Honduran Bishop Conference never denied that there was, never really dealt with the homosexual issue, denied that there was this culture, but it didn't go further specifically to rebut what was being said, just blamed Penton and those that were the whistleblowers. Now remember, in the United States, this idea of whistleblowers, they're protected. You don't blame the whistleblower. So that's what happened.
And the last question, you don't have to answer that one. You were inside in the Holy See. working for the international relations, for the human rights branch of the Vatican. What was that general attitude and the atmosphere there towards prosecuting criminal offenders responsible for the sexual misconduct? And what was the general opinion on the roots of the sexual misconduct?
Okay, so personally, when you're getting in, when you're in the Holy See, you don't get into philosophical discussions about roots, and I certainly didn't with anybody. So that's number one. Number two, when I was in there, there was people developing through the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith, but other people developing and thinking about these protection systems, specifically in Vatican City State, and now they exist. Because one of the things is the Holy See has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it implements in Vatican City State because human rights presupposes a territory. And the Holy See is the person of the Pope in the narrow sense, or the Pope in the dicasteries in the broader sense. It's not tied to a territory per se in terms of its international personality. However, the Pope is the absolute monarch of Vatican City State, and so it is a sovereign, and it has control over this territory. It has to implement those treaties there. Now, there were people trying to work on the protection systems in Vatican City State according to the obligations under international law to implement them, and according to undertakings that the Holy See had made to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and they were working on those. I think, and right now, some of those have been implemented, and also some new criminal laws that protect children. Now, the question then becomes, well, are there any children in Vatican City State? Is this just kind of just show laws? And at the time, there was a pre-seminary, and those were where the altar boys were staying, and they were going, celebrating Mass. They were the altar boys for the cardinals and celebrating Mass in the morning, and they were there. You also have children coming in and doing some work with their parents and other persons, a part of a couple associations that live there. And then you have people bringing in children when they go to the pharmacy and museums, etc. So you have children in Vatican City State. You have to deal with that. So there are people that are very serious to deal with that. But I think on the one hand that you have that, you still have people lacking behind, because this is in any institution. And in my study in the book, for example, that we did, I looked at the comparison of the McCarrick situation in the church to other secular institutions. And we had people in the church protecting McCarrick like in other secular institutions. So this idea of protecting the church by staying silent, and I think still remains for some people, even though I think Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and John Paul II has made inroads in trying to decrease this. But what we have at the end of the day is a reluctancy of people to call it what it is. And in some of these situations, we have people, and this is where Father Oko's work comes in, is that they are people that self-identify as homosexual, or they self-identify as being sympathetic to the gay culture, and they are promoting a certain perspective within the Roman Curia. Now, if you go back to the statistics of Father Sullins, if you look at the statistics he talked about, certainly the cases have gone down during certain years, but what we have is the high volume of homosexual priests that he saw, they're in their 60s and their 80s. So aren't those our bishops? And if those are our bishops and our cardinals, some of our cardinals, we're getting a lot of statements for the synodality now. It's pushing accompaniment, and no one really knows what accompaniment means, and everybody understands that when you're talking about LGB accompaniment, according to Reverend Martin, it's affirming persons in their sinful lifestyles. So if that's happening in the Vatican, and certainly it is, because we've got these series of statements coming out from bishops and cardinals, this is a problem. And not only that, I think in the study that Reverend Sullins did, he also saw an increase in sexual assaults of adults. And thanks to Pope Francis, after the February 2019 meeting, they do now recognize that you can sexually assault an adult. And of course you can. And when I think about this, you think about seminarians. They cannot give their consent to a person in authority like a rector. That's a person in trust. So the church has to work on this, and it has to recognize that you cannot ordain homosexual priests, ordain homosexual seminarians to become priests. It's like putting a heterosexual man in the locker room of a woman's locker room. I mean, this is common sense. You're putting a person in a situation of temptation, and we know that that is an occasion of sin. So we really have to understand that we're going in the wrong direction. Recently, a priest who's a psychologist came out and made a statement within the last week saying that pornography can be a legitimate sex relief. And he was refuting Pope Francis' common sense statement that pornography opens yourself up to the diabolical. And in fact, I have a book right now that's coming out, and I've got a chapter in that book that talks about how pornography is tied to the diabolical, and I am citing exorcists. So although we can talk about helping people with pornography, if it's child pornography, it's a crime. You've got to report that. And if it's an addiction that the person cannot break, you have to be consulting with exorcists. And that is the reality of the sexual revolution. And those people that are denying the virtue of chastity as being something that we need to talk about, we're in serious trouble if that's a position now that's being promoted. And I'm afraid that it is in some quarters.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
I strongly believe that your research is a step forward in the Catholic Church.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.